Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much to Judith and the All Energy team for the opportunity to speak. I guess what I'd like to do is kind of introduce this session by sharing a few thoughts and sort of give an introduction to topics that the panel might later debate, but also give you the Crown Estate's perspective on a few things. First, I'll start with a brief update on the Crown Estate's work in wave and tidal. I'll then share some thoughts on key progress indicators for the sector. I'll come on to some views on the landscape of financing technologies and projects, and finally share some of our thoughts on next steps. Firstly, to give an update on the Crown Estate's work in wave and tidal. I mean, essentially, we've been working in the wave and tidal current sectors in earnest for about 6 years or so, since 2008. With the inception of the Pentland Firth leasing round. As manager of the seabed around the UK, with rights to lease areas for offshore wind, tidal, wave, and various other energy projects, we're involved in quite a large number of developments, and you know, are in a position of sort of oversight of projects and indeed sort of whole sectors. So it's quite an interesting position to be. Our involvement usually starts quite early on in a project, when a developer has done some initial prospecting work and identified a site that they'd like to develop. And typically we provide an option agreement to that developer to progress that work. Over the last 6 years, we've leased around 40 sites for wave and tidal current projects. That's more than any other country in the world. And those sites are for a range of purposes. They're also a range of sizes. Some are intended for commercial projects for the sort of medium to long term. Others are for prototype testing and other technology development work right now. Also, as well as wave and tidal current, we're doing some work at the moment to think about tidal range and looking towards a leasing process for tidal range projects in the near future. However, our involvement doesn't stop at leasing areas of seabed, you know, providing sort of, you know, the equivalent of land rights. We're quite actively involved in the development process, and that's in two ways. One is by sharing some of the capabilities and expertise of our own team. Some of our team have experience themselves in energy project development and can lend help sometimes in areas like environmental impact assessment and consent. The other area is in commissioning research and other sort of technical studies to complement the efforts that developers are making on their own sites. We call that work enabling actions, and over the last few years we've committed about £3 million to that sort of work with some really great results. For example, we've created a methodology to assess the socioeconomic impacts of wave and tidal projects, which we know is of interest to developers, but also a range of stakeholders as well. And all of our enabling actions work is available to download from our website. A third area that we're working in, and is very much a focus at present, is looking to invest in first array projects. So we look at evolution of the wave and tidal sectors in terms of progressively larger schemes, but the sort of the logical step from single prototypes that are being tested at EMEC and elsewhere at the moment is small projects of multiple devices, first arrays. And what we're trying to do by looking to co-invest in such projects is essentially reduce the amount of capital that developers would otherwise have to source and share risks as those projects progress. So we're in detailed due diligence on several projects right now, and we hope to see one or two of those get to financial close. And finally, briefly, one other strand of our work, a quite important one actually, is in policy. We work very closely with DEC, the Scottish Government, Welsh Government, Northern Ireland Executive and other government bodies around the UK to help develop policies and implement those policies which you know, are effective to support growth of the sectors. Last year we completed a major study of the barriers facing developments in the Pentland Firth area, and we set out a number of recommendations for industry and government. There's a report that's on our website which you may be interested to look at. So secondly, to come on to progress indicators, I think that, you know, for many people involved in the wave and tidal sectors, it's already clear what progress is being made, but I think that for others looking in occasionally, it's possibly, you know, less easy to see. So I just wanted to touch on three areas. Firstly, technology investments. You know, over the last few years, several £100 million has been invested, largely by European industrial equipment manufacturers, in technology development, particularly focused on Tidal, but there's been further investment in Wave as well. And from our perspective, and I think from the perspective of many actors in the sectors, this is really excellent progress. It puts further technology development on a more secure footing, but also brings to bear the sort of the in-depth engineering expertise that's needed to move further. So that's one progress measure. A second progress measure is government financial support. Over the last few years, the UK, France, Canada, a few other countries as well have brought in feed-in tariffs and other financial support measures which could really be instrumental in helping projects to be developed. In the UK, the Scottish Government and DEC have done a lot of work to bring in revenue support. That's now available at 5 ROCs or £305 per megawatt hour under the CFD model, plus over £50 million of project-specific support, grants, other types of support has been offered by DEC, the Scottish Government, and the European Commission. And all of this is on top of, over a decade's worth of R&D support from the likes of Carbon Trust, ETI, and now the Offshore Renewables Catapult Centre. So I think actually, the position on government financial support is pretty favourable. Probably doesn't completely solve the sector's needs right now, but certainly, it's very positive. And finally, I wanted to point to project progress. From our perspective, getting projects ready to be built into construction is really key. Our business in Wave and Tidal depends on projects being built, basically, and producing rents. That's our business model. And I thought it was worth pointing to the facts that today over 150 megawatts of Wave and Tidal projects have obtained consents, and some other projects are due to go in for consents applications later this year. Again, that's more than any other country. And also, quite a few projects have already secured grid agreements. There are some challenges in certain areas like the Pentland Firth when new grid infrastructure is needed. But we'd expect, at least tens of megawatts of capacity could be connected around the UK in the coming years. And I think it's probably an opportunity, to congratulate the developers on the progress they've been making with projects. Turning now to financing and some of the challenges we see, I guess I'll try and sort of tackle this in two parts. First technology and then projects, and also draw some distinctions between Wave and Tidal. On the technology side, I think that one of the key aspects, key challenges for technology development is the cost of development. I guess the industry's experience over the last sort of 14, 15 years or so is that bringing a technology from the stage of a small-scale model or a physical model or a numerical model to a full-scale seagoing prototype is an endeavour which costs tens of millions of pounds. And taking the next steps to prove the device, as a commercial project requires more still. So that's pretty significant for companies to take on, particularly since all of that is pre-revenue, before they've actually sold products to the market. To some extent, the costs are kind of unavoidably high due to the need to build prototypes at meaningful physical scale, and also install them and access them in the sea, which is inevitably quite expensive. But nevertheless, good progress has been made, and while there's a need for further technology funding, I think there's also an opportunity to capitalise on the investment and government funding that's already been provided. I'll come back to that point in a moment. On the project side, I guess in comparison to technology, the cost of developing projects is relatively small. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of pounds or low millions to prepare a project site typically. And there are also many similarities to other types of project development. I guess offshore wind is an obvious comparator. So experience can be transferred, developers aren't starting from scratch. That said, there are some financial challenges, and one of those which I think has become particularly clear over the last sort of year, 18 months or so, is in relation to grid access. Where new grid infrastructure, transmission infrastructure in particular, is needed, it's proving really difficult for project developers to take on grid liabilities. That's partly due to other uncertainties, for example, the sort of time of technology readiness. But the cost level is significant in itself, and that's led some developers to kind of reappraise how they're approaching projects, including in the Pentland Firth. And I think, unfortunately, progress to resolve this issue of the cost of grid access and movement on grid infrastructure has been relatively slow. However, looking ahead, we can identify a few sort of key requirements. I think for WAVE, further funding for technology development is really at the core. For tidal currents, I guess right now we and other potential investors in first array projects are testing the efficacy of current support measures, but providing we're able to get projects away, I guess the question will move on to second arrays, to follow-on projects or scaling up projects which start to be installed. And I think these requirements, so technology funding for WAVE, second array funding for tidal current, will probably be issues to tackle over the next few years. Finally, I'd like to look briefly at some next steps for the sectors, particularly in relation to financing. I mentioned a moment ago the idea of sort of capitalising on existing funding investment. I think for WAVE that's really key. I think we kind of reached an interesting point with WAVE technology development where, in some cases there's a real depth of engineering knowledge and practical understanding. Some devices are very well understood in terms of their physics and engineering, but it's actually difficult to capitalise on this because sufficient financial resources aren't available. And I think that it looks most likely at the moment that government will need to support in this area. And I'm aware that a number of government bodies are sort of thinking in terms of a concerted effort, the various parts of government and government agencies working together essentially. I think it's really great that Scottish Enterprise, working with the rest of Scottish Government, is thinking through this in depth at the moment, and we're pleased to be able to help. Coming to Tidal, I guess that what's really key at the moment is continued investment and development by the industrial equipment manufacturers, companies like Siemens and Voith and Alstom and so on. I guess they're looking at not just the UK market, but also the French and Canadian markets as well. And I think from our perspective, the Crown Estate, even though we look only at the UK sort of day to day, we'd be really happy to see that those other markets, or indeed the markets still take off, because I think there's no doubt that the industry's ability to progress quickly and reduce costs is at least partly a function of the overall global market size, and not just in theoretical terms, but how that comes into being. So I think all power to the French and Canadian developments as well as UK ones. Finally, to touch on projects, we've been running a leasing process since October. It's brought in a new concept of demonstration zones, which we hope will be of value to helping further sort of technology development work to occur. Essentially, what we're trying to do is let some relatively large areas of seabed for sort of testing purposes to third parties who could then sublet to others, and also if those third parties have a sort of regional or local focus, assist with the development process and possibly provide infrastructure. You can look at the model as a sort of an EMEC scaled up or something like that. So we're in negotiations with third parties about a number of demonstration zones which we've defined. We've also had a pretty positive response from developers seeking other sites, and I hope to be able to we'll be able to make an announcement on the outcome of the leasing process next month. But I think suffice to say, at the moment we've been really encouraged by the response. So in closing, I'd just like to say, from Crown Estate's perspective, we remain very committed to helping the wave and tidal current sectors grow. As I've mentioned, we're also now looking in earnest at tidal range as well. And we're going to keep focused on supporting growth, working with industry and government, and trying to move things along as fast as we can. Thanks very much.